It began not with the prestige of laboratories, not under the vaulted ceilings of universities, but with the whirring of a small toy helicopter made of cork, bamboo, and rubber bands. It was nothing more than a child's plaything, a curiosity inspired by the French inventor Alphonse Pénaud. Yet in the hands of two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, this fragile toy carried the seed of a revolution that would change the trajectory of human civilization. At first, their idea seemed laughable. Learned men, scientists with degrees and reputations, declared that human flight was impossible, nonsense fit for dreamers and lunatics. Newspapers mocked them. Government officials turned their backs. Their workshop was not a grand institute, but a modest bicycle shop, filled with the smell of oil, metal shavings, and the rhythm of spinning wheels. And yet, from this humble corner of America, Orville and Wilbur Wright transformed the impossible into reality. On the 17th of December, 1903, on the windswept sands of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, their strange contraption, part kite, part bicycle, part dream, lifted from the earth. The world would never be the same. What began as a scientific toy had become a practical invention. What began as an invention was swiftly repurposed as a weapon. For within a decade, the airplane was no longer merely a symbol of daring ingenuity. It had become a military tool of destruction. By the time of the First World War, it rained bombs upon cities, spied from the clouds, and turned battlefields into theaters of death from above. The Wright brothers, neither trained scientists nor wealthy industrialists, had handed humanity both wings to soar and claws to tear itself apart. This is the story of how two self-taught men defied ridicule, rewrote the limits of possibility, and triggered a turning point in history so profound that it reshaped the modern world. It is a story of invention, doubt, triumph, and unintended consequences. It is the story of the Wright brothers. Long before the roar of propellers split the sky, before the word aviation had meaning to the common man, the story of the Wright brothers began quietly in the heart of America. Dayton, Ohio, was no capital of invention, no bustling Paris or London. It was a modest industrial town where factories hummed and railroads echoed through the air. Here, in a household marked not by wealth but by curiosity, two boys grew up surrounded by books, ideas, and the constant encouragement of their father. Wilbur Wright, 1867-1912, and Orville Wright, 1871-1948, known collectively as the Wright brothers. Wilbur was the more serious and analytical of the two, while Orville was known for his creativity and technical ingenuity. Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, a stern but open-minded man. He filled their home with religious texts, yes, but also with works of science, philosophy, and exploration. He encouraged his children to read widely, to ask questions, to challenge dogma. Their mother, Susan Kerner Wright, was no less influential. A gifted mechanic in her own right, she could build simple machines and repair household devices. From her, Wilbur and Orville inherited the hands-on ingenuity that would one day shape their destiny. The pivotal moment, however, came in the form of a simple toy helicopter. Their father brought it home one evening, a small contraption of cork, bamboo, and a rubber band twisted to power its propellers. The toy, invented by the French aeronautical pioneer Pénaud, leapt into the air with a surprising grace. It whirred, spun, and floated in the air before gently landing. To most children, it was a fleeting amusement, but to the Wright brothers it was a spark that ignited a fire. Wilbur and Orville studied the toy, broke it apart, rebuilt it, and tried to make their own larger versions. Of course, their attempts failed at first. The bigger the toy, the less it wanted to fly. Yet in these failures lay lessons about weight, balance, and the stubborn laws of physics. The brothers began to wonder, if a toy could fly, could a man? Their childhood was not unlike that of other boys of their time. They skated, sledded, and played outside. But in their hearts there was always an extra gear turning, a curiosity that wouldn't rest. Unlike many children who abandoned their fascinations, the Wright brothers carried this spark into adulthood. Wilbur, the elder, was thoughtful, serious, and analytical. Orville, the younger, was energetic, creative, and daring. Together, they formed a perfect balance, Wilbur the thinker, Orville the doer. Their partnership would prove to be the key ingredient in their later success. In the late 19th century, the dream of human flight was not new. For centuries, mankind had looked at birds and envied their wings. From the myth of Icarus to Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines, visionaries had tried and failed. But in the 1,800 seconds, despite some advances in balloons and gliders, the general consensus was still that powered, controlled flight was impossible. Scientists of the day, armed with mathematics and authority, declared it a fantasy. And so, when two bicycle mechanics from Dayton dared to pursue this fantasy, they were dismissed as fools. Yet, in the basement of their childhood home, in the backyard of their workshop, the Wright brothers were laying the groundwork for a revolution. What started with a toy would grow into the greatest turning point in the history of transportation, warfare, and human imagination. Dayton, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city of invention. It was home to cash registers, automobiles, and new machinery that transformed daily life. The Wright brothers, though fascinated by flight, needed to earn a living. In 1892, they opened a bicycle sales and repair shop, the Wright Cycle Company. At first, it was nothing extraordinary. They sold popular models, repaired broken frames, replaced chains. But soon the shop became more than a business. It became a workshop of ideas. Bicycles were the perfect training ground for inventors of flight. They demanded balance, precision, and control, three principles that would later become the foundation of aviation. Orville and Wilbur didn't just sell bicycles. They built their own models. They experimented with lighter frames, stronger wheels, more reliable mechanisms. Their shop was filled with the sounds of clinking tools, whirring gears, and the brothers' constant discussions about motion and stability. In the quiet hours, when customers were gone, their minds turned again to flight. Newspapers occasionally reported on daring glider attempts in Europe, particularly the work of Otto Lilienthal, the German glider king. Lilienthal's experiments, launching himself from hillsides with bird-like wings, captured their imagination. His tragic death in 1896, after a glider crash broke his spine, only deepened their determination. If human flight were ever to succeed, it would need control and safety, not reckless leaps from cliffs. The Wrights studied Lilienthal's writings, along with the works of Sir George Cayley, Octave Chanute, and Samuel Langley. Langley, the head of the Smithsonian Institution, was particularly celebrated in America for his experiments with powered models. Yet the Wright brothers, reading about Langley's failures with his large aerodrome machines, grew skeptical. They saw a flaw. Inventors were focused on power, not control. A powerful engine meant nothing if the craft could not be steered. This realization became their guiding philosophy. The problem is not to invent a motor, but to learn to control a flying machine. Their bicycle shop provided them with two things essential for invention: money and materials. Profits funded their experiments. Bicycles gave them knowledge of balance, gears, and mechanics. And their reputation as reliable mechanics meant they had a place in the community, even as neighbors chuckled at their obsession with flying machines. In the evenings, they built small wind tunnels, tested wing shapes, and studied airflow. They carved wooden propellers as carefully as they once carved bicycle spokes. Every failed test was not a defeat, but a data point. Bit by bit, they were building an understanding of flight that no scientist had yet achieved. The bicycle had once been dismissed as a fad, a toy for the young, but the Wright brothers knew better. Mastering two wheels required the same instincts as mastering wings. From the balance of bicycles would come the balance of airplanes. It was in this modest shop, with oil-stained floors and the steady rhythm of work, that the Wright brothers laid the hidden foundation for humanity's leap into the skies. By the late 1890 seconds, the Wright brothers had reached a crucial conclusion. Before they could dream of powered flight, they had to master the art of gliding. To fly like a bird was not simply a matter of attaching wings to an engine. A bird banked, tilted, and curved gracefully through the air. Humans would have to learn the same control. And so, the Wright brothers began searching for a place where they could test their gliders without interference and with plenty of wind. They pored over government weather data. What they needed was steady, strong winds, soft, sandy ground to cushion crashes, and enough isolation to experiment without onlookers mocking their failures. Their search led them to a remote stretch of the North Carolina coast, Kitty Hawk, a lonely village surrounded by dunes, ocean surf, and relentless winds. In September 1900, Wilbur Wright boarded a train headed south. He traveled with crates of wood, cloth, and tools, as well as letters of introduction. When he arrived at Kitty Hawk, the locals were curious but skeptical. Why would two men from Ohio drag strange contraptions to their windy shores? Yet the Wrights were undeterred. They set up camp among the dunes, living in simple tents and later building a small shack. Their first glider, based loosely on Lilienthal's designs but improved through their own calculations, looked like a giant box kite. It had a wingspan of about 17 feet and was covered in muslin cloth. But the key difference lay in their unique invention, wing warping. By twisting the wings in opposite directions, they could control the roll of the aircraft. This was their breakthrough idea, the seed of the three-axis control system that remains the basis of flight today. The 1,900 glider did not carry them far. In fact, it often flew better as a kite than as a manned craft. But it taught them valuable lessons. They discovered that the published data of lift coefficients, even from respected scientists, were often wrong. Theories crumbled in the face of the harsh Carolina wind. Undaunted, they returned in 1901 with a larger glider, nearly 22 feet across. This time, disappointment struck harder. The lift was far less than expected. Wilbur, usually the optimist, confessed to Octave Chanute in a letter, "I have no hope of ever being able to accomplish flight successfully." Yet in despair was born determination. If the data of others were flawed, they would gather their own. Back in Dayton, they built a homemade wind tunnel, a wooden box with a fan, where they tested over 200 miniature wings. They measured lift, drag, and efficiency with extraordinary precision. Out of this work emerged a new set of aerodynamic tables that would surpass all previous studies. They were no longer imitators of science. They were becoming scientists themselves. By 1902, they returned to Kitty Hawk with a redesigned glider, one that incorporated not only wing warping for roll, but also a movable rudder for yaw. This machine, with a wingspan of 32 feet, was the most advanced glider the world had yet seen. On the dunes of Kill Devil Hills, they ran, leapt, and soared, controlling their flight with a mastery that astonished even themselves. They achieved hundreds of flights, some lasting nearly a minute, gliding gracefully down the slopes. For the first time in history, human beings had full control of a flying machine. Not just lift, not just thrust, but control. The skies were opening, and yet the world barely noticed. Newspapers ignored them. The scientific establishment dismissed them. To the outside world, they were just two eccentric bicycle mechanics playing in the sand. But the brothers knew they had crossed a threshold. With control mastered, all that remained was to add power. The dunes of Kitty Hawk, with their whipping winds and endless horizons, had become the cradle of aviation. The year was 1903. The Wright brothers had conquered gliding, had mastered control, and had rewritten the very mathematics of aerodynamics. Now only one great obstacle remained: power. Engines of the time were heavy, bulky, and designed for automobiles or factories, not for flight. The Wrights needed something far lighter, yet strong enough to push a man and machine into the air. No manufacturer could provide what they wanted, so they did what they had always done. They built it themselves. Working in their Dayton bicycle shop, they enlisted their trusted mechanic, Charlie Taylor, to help design a simple but revolutionary motor. It was a 4-cylinder, 12-horsepower engine weighing about 180 pounds. By modern standards, it was crude, but it was exactly what the Flyer needed. Alongside the engine, the brothers designed propellers, unlike any that had come before. They realized that a propeller was not merely a screw in the air, but a rotating wing. With their wind tunnel data, they carved wooden propellers by hand with precision that rivaled fine craftsmanship. When tested, their efficiency exceeded most propellers built even decades later. By the fall of 1903, the Flyer I was ready. Wingspan, 40 feet, 4 inches. Weight, 605 pounds with engine. Frame, spruce wood, muslin fabric. Controls, wing warping, rudder, and elevator. It was a fragile creature, half bicycle, half kite, half dream, and yet in its ribs and fabric lived the potential to change the world. In December, the brothers returned to Kitty Hawk. The weather was bitterly cold. Winds howled across the dunes. They hauled the Flyer up to a rail they had built for launching. On the morning of the 17th of December, 1903, after weeks of delays, they decided the time had come. At 10:35 a.m., Orville Wright lay flat on the lower wing, hands on the controls. Wilbur steadied the craft as the engine sputtered to life. The Flyer shuddered forward down the rail. For a moment it seemed too fragile, too unstable. Then, suddenly, its wings caught the wind. The Flyer rose. 12 seconds? 36 meters? It was not elegant, nor long, nor high, but it was flight, powered, controlled, sustained flight. Over the course of the morning, the brothers made 4 flights. The longest, piloted by Wilbur, lasted 59 seconds and traveled 260 meters. With each attempt, they proved that this was no fluke, no trick. The age-old dream of human flight had been realized. And yet, when they sent word to newspapers, the reaction was muted, even dismissive. A local journal buried the news beneath trivial stories. Reporters scoffed, unable to believe that 2 unknown bicycle mechanics had accomplished what great institutions had failed to achieve. Samuel Langley's failed aerodrome, which crashed spectacularly into the Potomac River just weeks before, had made headlines. The Wrights' triumph was ignored. But history had shifted. In the sands of Kitty Hawk, mankind had crossed a threshold. The dream of Icarus was no longer myth, it was fact. The world had wings. What the Wrights could not yet know was how swiftly their fragile invention would evolve, and how quickly it would be transformed from a scientific marvel into a tool of war. The triumph of the 17th of December, 1903, should have echoed across the globe. It should have filled front pages and rewritten textbooks overnight. But instead, the Wright brothers returned to Dayton to find the world indifferent, even dismissive. Few believed their claim. Some accused them of exaggeration. Others ignored them outright. Part of the problem was their own secrecy. The brothers understood that their invention, if proven, had immense value. They were determined to secure patents and protect their designs before demonstrating them too widely. Unlike showmen, they were meticulous, cautious, and protective. This secrecy, however, fed suspicion. If their machine really flew, why did no one see it? Why were there no grand exhibitions? Back home in Ohio, they continued their experiments at a cow pasture called Huffman Prairie. It was here, in 1904 and 1905, that they transformed their fragile Flyer into the world's first practical airplane. Day after day, they hauled their machine across uneven fields, tinkering, adjusting and enduring endless crashes. Neighbors gathered occasionally to watch, puzzled but unimpressed. In 1904, their flights were short, often no more than a circle. But by 1905, they had achieved something astonishing. Sustained flights lasting 38 minutes, covering 24 miles, circling the field with precision. They could take off, maneuver, and land at will. They had not merely flown, they had mastered aviation. And still, the world remained skeptical. Few reporters came, and those who did often misunderstood what they saw. In the age before film and widespread photography, the Wrights' claims seemed fantastical. Even the U.S. government, when approached by the brothers with offers to sell their invention, declined. The War Department dismissed their proposals as impractical, preferring to fund more established scientists. Frustration grew. The Wrights had conquered the skies, yet they could not convince others of their success. Meanwhile, inventors in Europe, men like Alberto Santos Dumont in France, were making highly publicized flights, garnering attention and praise. To the Europeans, America's claims were dubious at best. Finally, in 1908, after years of being ignored, the Wrights agreed to public demonstrations. They signed contracts with both the U.S. Army and a group of French investors, promising to deliver a flying machine capable of carrying passengers. Now, secrecy had to give way to proof. In May 1908, Wilbur traveled to France while Orville prepared for demonstrations in Virginia. The stakes were immense. Their reputation, their contracts, their very legacy hung in the balance. In France, skepticism ran high. European aviators were convinced the Wrights were frauds. Newspapers called them bluffers. Yet when Wilbur unveiled the flyer at Le Mans in August 1908, the tone of the world shifted overnight. On a warm summer evening, as crowds gathered, Wilbur rose into the sky. He didn't just fly straight. He banked gracefully, circled the field, and landed with perfect control. The crowd gasped, then erupted in thunderous applause. The impossible had been made undeniable. One French newspaper declared, "For the first time, we saw a man rise into the air and return exactly to the point from which he started." Wilbur became a sensation, hailed as a genius. In Paris, he was mobbed by admirers, toasted by aristocrats, and studied by engineers. Orville's flights in Virginia soon followed, equally impressive, cementing the brothers' fame on both continents. At last, after years of obscurity and ridicule, the Wright brothers had achieved recognition. Their invention was no longer a fantasy. It was real, practical, and unstoppable. But along with fame came a darker truth. The militaries of the world now saw the airplane not just as a marvel, but as a weapon. The machine born of a toy and perfected in a bicycle shop was about to be conscripted into war. When Wilbur circled the fields of Le Mans in 1908, the crowd saw a miracle of modern ingenuity. But among the onlookers were not only journalists, aristocrats, and curious citizens. There were also military officers, their eyes sharp, their notebooks ready. To them, the airplane was not merely a wonder, it was a potential weapon. The Wright brothers had always imagined peaceful uses for their invention: transportation, communication, exploration. Yet from the very beginning, armies and governments envisioned something else entirely: a machine that could fly over borders, scout enemy lines, and perhaps even deliver destruction from above was too valuable to ignore. By 1909, the brothers had signed contracts not only with the U.S. Army, but also with European governments. Their flyer, once dismissed as a child's fancy, was now the subject of military trials. In September of that year, Orville demonstrated the Signal Corps flyer for the U.S. Army at Fort Myer, Virginia. It carried a passenger, remained aloft for over an hour, and proved its worth as a tool of reconnaissance. For the first time, the airplane entered military service. At first, its role was limited to scouting and observation. Pilots flew low over enemy positions. sketching trenches and artillery placements. But technology evolves quickly in times of war. By 1914, as the First World War erupted across Europe, the airplane was thrust into combat. At the beginning of the war, aircraft were unarmed, fragile, and used mostly for gathering intelligence. Pilots carried pistols or rifles, firing awkwardly at enemy planes. But necessity is the mother of invention, and soon machine guns were mounted to wings and fuselages. Ingenious engineers developed synchronization gears, allowing bullets to pass safely through spinning propellers. Within a few short years, the skies above Europe were transformed into deadly battlefields. The dogfight was born. Airplanes that once glided gracefully above sandy dunes now twisted and spun in violent duels. Names like the Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen became synonymous with aerial combat. The airplane also became a tool of terror. Bombs were dropped on enemy trenches, factories, even cities. For the first time in human history, war was no longer confined to the ground. The sky had become a weaponized frontier. The Wright brothers, who had once struggled for recognition, now watched as their invention was embraced by every major military power. Yet with this embrace came unease. They had sought to solve a problem of science, not to unleash destruction. In quieter moments, Orville admitted to friends that he regretted how quickly their machine had been transformed into an instrument of war. Wilbur, who died tragically young in 1912 from typhoid fever, did not live to see the full horror of his invention's militarization. Orville, living until 1948, saw the airplane evolve from fragile wood and fabric into monstrous bombers capable of leveling entire cities. The irony was bitter. What began as a playful toy, nurtured in a bicycle shop, had grown into a machine that changed not only how humans traveled, but how they killed. The turning point of history was not just the dawn of aviation, it was the dawn of a new age of warfare. Yet even in war, the promise of flight could not be contained. Between battles, visionaries dreamed of airlines, cargo transport, and the freedom of connecting continents. The airplane was a paradox, a symbol of progress and a shadow of destruction, a marvel of imagination and a tool of death. The Wright brothers had given the world wings. What humanity chose to do with them was another story. The guns of the First World War fell silent in 1918, but the roar of engines did not. Across Europe and America, thousands of airplanes sat idle, relics of battlefields now at peace. Pilots, trained in the crucible of war, searched for new purposes. The world was ready to discover what airplanes could do beyond destruction. The answer was commerce and connection. In the years following the war, governments and entrepreneurs began converting surplus military planes into civilian transport. Canvas-covered biplanes that once carried observers now carried mail sacks. The U.S. Post Office became one of the first major employers of pilots, launching airmail routes across the country. Risky and dangerous, these flights pushed aviation into the public consciousness. Soon, the idea of carrying passengers followed naturally. If an airplane could deliver letters faster than trains, why not people? In 1919, a small British airline began scheduled passenger flights from London to Paris. The planes were noisy, cramped, and often unreliable, but they represented something unprecedented: the ability to cross the English Channel in hours instead of days. The 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds came to be known as the Golden Age of aviation. Sleek new designs replaced the rickety frames of the past. Metal began to replace wood, enclosed cabins replaced open cockpits, and radial engines gave airplanes new power. Air shows dazzled crowds. Stunt pilots, the barnstormers, flew through loops and rolls, landing in farmers' fields to give rides for a few dollars. Aviation fever spread like wildfire. In the United States, companies like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed began experimenting with larger passenger planes. Across the Atlantic, European manufacturers like Junkers and de Havilland pushed forward as well. By the late 1922, airlines were forming: KLM, Lufthansa, Pan American Airways, Imperial Airways. What had once been impossible, linking cities and even continents by air, was now becoming routine. No technological revolution is complete without its icons, and aviation produced heroes whose names still resonate. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh captured the world's imagination with his solo, non-stop flight across the Atlantic in the spirit of Street Lewis. The journey from New York to Paris took 33.5 hours, and when Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget Field, hundreds of thousands of people mobbed the airfield. He was hailed as a modern Columbus, proving that the oceans were no longer barriers. Amelia Earhart, too, became a symbol of daring and progress. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, breaking barriers not only in aviation but in society's expectations of women. Her mysterious disappearance in 1937 during an attempted round-the-world flight only deepened her legend. By the end of the 1,930 seconds, airlines were carrying thousands of passengers each year. Air travel, once a novelty for the wealthy or adventurous, was becoming a practical alternative to trains and ships. Cities once separated by weeks of travel were now a day apart. The world itself seemed to shrink. The Wright brothers could scarcely have imagined such a transformation when they tested their first gliders at Kitty Hawk. Within 3 decades of their first powered flight, their invention had grown from fragile wood and cloth to sleek airliners connecting nations. Yet the airplane's double life continued. Even as airlines rose, military planners once again eyed the skies. The 1,930 seconds brought a new generation of bombers and fighters, setting the stage for the most devastating conflict in human history. The dream of connecting the world would soon collide once more with the nightmare of global war. By the late 1,930 seconds, the promise and peril of flight were inseparable. Commercial aviation was shrinking the globe, but militaries had not forgotten the lessons of the First World War. If the airplane could scout, it could also fight. If it could carry mail, it could also carry bombs. As tensions flared across Europe and Asia, the airplane evolved into one of the most decisive weapons of the 20th century. World War II began in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, and from the very first days, the airplane proved indispensable. The Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, unleashed the doctrine of blitzkrieg lightning war, where tanks on the ground were paired with dive bombers and fighters in the sky. Speed, shock, and overwhelming force depended on air power. Britain answered with its own aerial defense, the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain in 1940 marked the first major campaign fought entirely in the skies. Spitfires and Hurricanes clashed with Messerschmitts and Heinkels over English fields. Radar, a new technology, gave the British a critical edge. Winston Churchill would later declare of the RAF pilots, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." In the Pacific, Japan's air power demonstrated the devastating potential of aviation at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. A fleet of aircraft carriers launched hundreds of planes in a surprise attack that crippled much of the U.S. Navy. It was proof that wars were no longer decided only on land or sea. The sky was now the decisive frontier. As the conflict expanded, every major power poured resources into building faster, stronger, deadlier planes. Fighters like the P-51 Mustang, Zero, and Messerschmitt Bf-109 dueled in the skies. Bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress, Lancaster, and Heinkel. He-111 delivered destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Strategic bombing campaigns scarred Europe and Asia. Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo, entire cities were reduced to rubble under waves of incendiary bombs. The very invention that had once lifted humanity into the sky now rained fire upon millions below. Civilians were no longer shielded by distance. The war came to their doorsteps from above. The Wright brothers, had they been alive together, would have been astonished and perhaps horrified. In just 4 decades, the fragile flyer of 1903 had evolved into fleets of machines that could cross oceans and annihilate entire cities. The culmination came in August 1945. The U.S. B-29 superfortress Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island, carrying a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. When it dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, followed days later by Nagasaki, the airplane became the delivery system for humanity's most destructive invention. In a bitter twist of history, the machine, once dismissed as a toy, had become the vehicle for ending a world war through apocalyptic force. The Wright brothers had dreamed of lifting men into the air. They could not have imagined their invention would one day carry the weight of nuclear fire. World War II proved that air power could determine the fate of nations. It also cemented the airplane's paradoxical role: savior and destroyer, liberator and executioner. The same technology that allowed Allied bombers to defeat fascism also unleashed terror upon civilians. Yet from the ashes of war, a new age was dawning. Jet engines, developed during the war, promised even faster, higher, and more efficient flight. Commercial aviation, once again, would reclaim the skies, this time not just for mail or a handful of passengers, but for the masses. The world had entered the atomic age, and with it, the jet age. The airplane was no longer a fragile machine of wood and cloth. It had become the steel-winged symbol of both progress and peril. When the guns of World War II fell silent, the world lay in ruins. Yet from the destruction, technology surged forward. Among the most transformative innovations to emerge was the jet engine. During the war, pioneers like Britain's Frank Whittle and Germany's Hans von Ohain had experimented with jet propulsion, replacing propellers with turbines that compressed air and blasted it out at tremendous speed. By 1945, jet fighters, like the British Gloster Meteor and the German Me-262, had already proven that the jet age was inevitable. Now, in peace, the jet engine turned from a weapon into a tool for connection. The fragile flyers of 1903 had evolved into sleek machines capable of crossing continents and oceans in hours rather than days. In the late 1942, commercial manufacturers seized upon jet technology. Propeller-driven airliners, like the Douglas DC-4 and Lockheed Constellation, had carried passengers across the Atlantic, but jets promised something revolutionary: speed, altitude, and comfort. The first commercial jet airliner, the de Havilland Comet, took to the skies in 1949. Its smooth fuselage, pressurized cabin, and turbojet engines dazzled the public. Suddenly, passengers could fly above storms at speeds over 400 miles per hour. London to Johannesburg, New York to Rome, the world's distances were shrinking faster than ever. Tragedy, however, struck in the early 1950s when several comets suffered catastrophic crashes due to metal fatigue. The setbacks were painful but instructive. Aviation engineers learned hard lessons about pressurization, metallurgy, and design, paving the way for safer, stronger aircraft. By the mid-1950s, American companies surged ahead. The Boeing 707, entering service in 1958, became the first widely successful commercial jetliner. Pan American Airways inaugurated jet service from New York to Paris, cutting travel time nearly in half compared to propeller planes. The jet age had truly arrived. The impact was immediate and profound. Businessmen could travel across continents in a single day. Families could visit relatives on the other side of the world. Students, tourists, and adventurers could cross oceans not as a rare feat, but as a practical journey. The phrase, "the world is shrinking," became common. Time zones, once barriers, now simply marked the hours passengers crossed at 500 miles per hour. A trip that had taken Lindbergh more than 33 hours in 1927 now took less than 8 inches of Boeing 707. Airports expanded into bustling international hubs. JFK in New York, Heathrow in London, Orly in Paris. These became gateways to a globalized planet. Flight attendants in their crisp uniforms symbolized glamour and sophistication. Advertisements portrayed flying as the height of modern luxury: champagne at 30,000 feet, silver service meals, and smiling crews. But even in this age of connection, the shadow of war lingered. The Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union extended into the skies. Air travel became both a tool of diplomacy and a display of national pride. The Soviet Union introduced its own jets, such as the Tupolev Tuesday 104, which stunned the West when it entered service in 1956. For decades, Western and Soviet airlines competed not only in technology, but in symbolism. An airplane was no longer just a machine, it was a statement of power, modernity, and influence. By the 1,960 seconds, commercial aviation had become central to the modern world. Airlines carried millions of passengers annually, linking cities and cultures with unprecedented ease. What began with a toy helicopter in the Wright household, nurtured in a bicycle shop, and proven on the sands of Kitty Hawk, had become the very backbone of global mobility. The brothers had dreamed of human flight as a means of exploration and connection. Though their invention had been used in war, the jet age restored something of their vision, a world where the sky was a bridge, not a battlefield. Yet even greater marvels lay just ahead. The jet age was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where humanity would dare not only to cross oceans, but to leave the planet entirely. The jet age had already transformed the world, but human ambition is never satisfied with fast enough. By the 1,960 seconds, engineers, politicians, and dreamers were reaching for 2 new horizons: supersonic flight in outer space. Both were direct descendants of the Wright brothers' fragile flyer, proof that once humanity had taken to the air, there would be no limit to how high or how fast it could go. In the final years of World War II, German jets hinted at new possibilities, but it was the Americans who achieved the next great milestone. On the 14th of October 1947, test pilot Chuck Yeager strapped himself into the rocket-powered Bell X-1 and roared through the skies over the Mojave Desert. With a thunderous boom, he became the first human to break the sound barrier. What the Wrights had accomplished in 1903 at 30 miles per hour had now been surpassed by a man flying faster than the speed of sound. Supersonic flight, once considered impossible, was now a reality. This breakthrough inspired a new generation of supersonic aircraft, not only for military use, but also for commercial dreams. Engineers in Britain and France collaborated on what would become the most iconic supersonic airliner, the Concorde. Sleek, elegant, with its slender delta wings and drooping nose, the Concorde symbolized the height of aviation luxury. In 1969, it made its first test flight. By 1976, it was flying passengers across the Atlantic in less than 4 hours, half the time of conventional jets. Although only a select few could afford its tickets, the Concorde embodied the dream of faster, higher, further. While supersonic planes pushed boundaries within Earth's atmosphere, another race was unfolding beyond it. The Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had extended into space exploration. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. 4 years later, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. These milestones stunned the world and raised urgent questions in Washington. If the Soviets could reach space, what else could they do? The United States responded with the Apollo program, an audacious plan to land men on the moon. On the 20th of July, 1969, as Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface, he spoke words that echoed the Wright's legacy. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The journey from Kitty Hawk to the moon had taken just 66 years. The connection was clear. The first controlled flight in 1903 had ignited a chain of progress that carried humanity beyond the Earth itself. Back on Earth, aviation became not just transportation, but culture and symbol. Airports were architectural marvels, and airlines competed with glamorous advertising campaigns. Stewardesses, as flight attendants were then called, were styled as icons of elegance. Flying was not merely practical. It was an event, a statement of modernity. Yet alongside glamour, tensions grew. Hijackings in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds revealed the darker vulnerabilities of global air travel. And environmentalists began to question the noise and pollution of supersonic planes like the Concorde. Even as technology soared, society wrestled with its costs. Had Wilbur and Orville been alive to see these decades, they would have been astonished. From their wooden flyer, which barely cleared the dunes of Kitty Hawk, to a jetliner capable of crossing the Atlantic in 3 hours, to rockets carrying astronauts to the moon, it was progress almost beyond belief. The world now lived in a dual legacy. Airliners shrank continents, while space travel expanded humanity's reach into the cosmos. The Wright brothers had not just invented a machine. They had ignited an era of exploration that no frontier could contain. But the journey was far from over. The closing decades of the 20th century would bring both triumph and tragedy, as aviation faced new challenges, from disasters in the skies to the democratization of global travel. By the close of the 1,970 seconds, the age of aviation had already stretched from fragile wood and cloth to supersonic icons like the Concorde and rocket ships that had carried men to the moon. Yet, as the 1,980 seconds dawned, the story of flight entered a new phase. The airplane was no longer a marvel reserved for the wealthy or the daring. It had become ordinary. What once stunned crowds now quietly shaped everyday life. At the heart of this transformation stood the wide-body jet, above all the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet. First introduced in 1970, by the 1,980 seconds, it had become the true queen of the skies. Its double-deck hump, cavernous interior, and long-range power symbolized a new world of accessibility. Families could now afford to cross oceans. Students could travel for education abroad. Businessmen could hold meetings in London and Tokyo in the same week. Air travel had matured into the backbone of globalization. But the ordinary nature of flight did not erase its dangers. For every triumph in the skies, there were moments of horror that shook public confidence. In 1977, on the Spanish island of Tenerife, two 747 seconds collided on a foggy runway, killing more than 580 people in the deadliest accident in aviation history. The tragedy became a grim lesson in communication and protocol, pushing the industry to refine cockpit procedures and standardize clear English phrases to prevent misinterpretation. Through the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, other disasters followed. The bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie in 1988, which scattered debris across the Scottish countryside, the explosion of TWA Flight 800 off Long Island in 1996, and countless smaller accidents that reminded passengers that while safer than ever, aviation was still a domain where errors could be unforgiving. Even the mighty Concorde, symbol of elegance and speed, suffered catastrophe in 2000 when a burst tire caused a fatal fire shortly after takeoff from Paris, bringing an abrupt end to the era of commercial supersonic travel. Yet each tragedy brought not paralysis, but progress. Engineers redesigned engines, reinforced fuel tanks, and refined safety systems. Cockpits shifted from analog dials to digital glass displays. Aircraft were fitted with ground proximity warnings, collision avoidance systems, and increasingly sophisticated autopilot technology. Paradoxically, while news headlines fixated on disaster, statistics showed that the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds were among the safest decades in aviation history, with accidents per passenger mile dropping steadily. Meanwhile, the culture of flying changed. The glamour of the jet age began to fade as airlines transitioned from luxury service to mass transportation. Low-cost carriers like Southwest in the United States, Ryanair in Europe, and AirAsia in Asia pioneered a new model. No frills, flights at prices so low that entire populations who had never flown before now joined the skies. Flying was no longer a privilege, it was becoming a rite of modern life. But as the skies opened, they also became vulnerable. Aircraft were symbols of modernity, freedom, and mobility, and thus irresistible targets for political violence. Hijackings punctuated the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. The 1,985 hijacking of TWA Flight 847 and the bombing of Air India Flight 182 the same year highlighted the grim reality that airliners could be turned into instruments of terror. Airports added security checkpoints, metal detectors, and baggage screening, but the threats continued. Then came the 11th of September, 2001. On that clear morning in the United States, 19 hijackers commandeered 4 passenger planes and turned them into weapons of war. 2 crashed into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon, and another into a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost. The sight of jetliners used as missiles seared itself into global memory, transforming not only aviation but the course of world history. In the aftermath, aviation was forever changed. Security hardened overnight. Fortified cockpit doors, rigorous passenger screening, new federal air marshal programs, and an atmosphere of vigilance that redefined the experience of flying. Airports became fortresses. For passengers, the journey through metal detectors and body scanners became as routine as boarding the aircraft itself. The paradox of flight had never been sharper. The airplane, born from a child's toy and perfected in a bicycle shop, had given humanity wings that carried families to reunions, lovers to faraway cities, and knowledge across oceans. Yet those same wings had also carried bombs to cities, fire to villages, and terror into the heart of New York. As the first decade of the new millennium unfolded, humanity faced a new question. How could aviation remain the tool of freedom and connection without becoming a tool of destruction? The next chapters of flight would explore not only technology and safety, but the very balance between liberty and security in a world bound together by the skies. By the early 2000 seconds, air travel had become the nervous system of globalization. Every day, millions of people crossed borders on wide-body jets, carrying with them not just luggage, but ideas, capital, and cultures. Container ships may have transported goods, but it was airplanes that transported minds. Students traveled abroad in record numbers. International business expanded at dizzying speed, and tourism became one of the most powerful engines of the global economy. The Wright brothers' dream had not only come true, it had become the daily rhythm of modern life. Yet the paradox remained. While air travel connected humanity, it also magnified its vulnerabilities. After the 11th of September attacks, the industry entered an era of unprecedented security. Passengers lined up shoeless at checkpoints, surrendered liquids and sharp objects, and passed through machines that scanned their very bodies. Airports became fortresses, their sterile corridors symbols of both safety and suspicion. For many, flying no longer carried the romance of adventure, but the tension of surveillance. At the same time, the scale of aviation reached heights the brothers from Dayton could never have imagined. The Airbus A380, unveiled in 2005, stretched across runways like a small city in motion, carrying more than 500 passengers in 2 full decks of cabins. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, with its composite materials and fuel efficiency, redefined the economics of long-haul flight. Aircraft no longer just connected New York to London. They connected secondary cities across continents, Doha to Seattle, Shenzhen to Los Angeles, Nairobi to Dubai. But with expansion came fragility. The 2008 global financial crisis struck airlines hard, forcing mergers, bankruptcies, and restructurings. Carriers cut costs, trimmed routes, and embraced low-cost models. Flying became more affordable, but also more cramped, with narrower seats, reduced service, and a focus on efficiency over luxury. The democratization of the skies carried a price. Convenience often trumped comfort. Then came the crisis no one could predict. In 2020, a microscopic virus grounded the global fleet. The COVID-19 pandemic emptied airports and silenced skies. Iconic aircraft like the A380 were mothballed. Airlines slashed staff and canceled thousands of flights. For months, the vast networks of global aviation shrank to a skeleton, reminding the world that even the most powerful human inventions remain vulnerable to forces of nature. The silence over once busy skies felt almost apocalyptic, as if the age of flight itself had paused. Yet resilience prevailed. As vaccines spread and borders reopened, aviation rebounded with astonishing speed. The hunger for travel, suppressed during lockdowns, returned with force. Families reunited, tourists surged, and airlines, though scarred, found new strength. The pandemic became another chapter in aviation's long history of crisis and recovery, proof that the human desire to fly is irrepressible. Beyond recovery, the 21st century also brought new frontiers. Climate change placed aviation under scrutiny as one of the fastest-growing sources of emissions. Engineers and policymakers turned to sustainable fuels, electric prototypes, and even hydrogen-powered designs. Startups promised air taxis buzzing over cities. Billionaires pursued private spaceflight, blurring the line between aviation and astronautics. For the first time since Kitty Hawk, the very definition of flight was expanding once more. And so, more than a century after Orville's first 12-second hop at Kitty Hawk, the airplane stands at another turning point. It is a machine so ordinary that billions have flown on it, yet so extraordinary that it still embodies both wonder and danger. It is at once the backbone of globalization and a target of scrutiny, a source of connection and a cause of division. The Wright brothers never claimed to be scientists, never sought to be revolutionaries, yet their fragile flyer triggered a chain of events that reshaped every aspect of human life, from the way wars are fought to the way lovers cross oceans, from the spread of pandemics to the spread of ideas. Their invention has been mocked, celebrated, weaponized, democratized, and now challenged to become sustainable. The world has grown small. The sky has become familiar. And yet, every time an airplane lifts its nose from the runway and climbs into the clouds, it echoes that morning in 1903 when a wooden machine shuddered forward on a sandy rail and proved that the impossible was possible. The Wright brothers handed humanity a gift, wings. What we do with them remains the unfinished story of our age. The story of flight has always been about reaching further than imagination allows. From the fragile flyer at Kitty Hawk to jetliners streaking between continents, the history of aviation is proof that humanity refuses to remain earthbound. But the 21st century has opened an even larger canvas. The future of flight is not only about going faster or higher, but about redefining what flight means for a species that now dreams beyond its own planet. One of the greatest challenges confronting aviation is its environmental cost. As billions take to the skies each year, jet engines pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change. The Wright brothers once solved the puzzle of lift and control. Today's engineers must solve the puzzle of sustainability. Electric aircraft, powered by advanced batteries, promise short-haul flights with zero emissions. Startups are building sleek prototypes, capable of carrying a handful of passengers across regional routes. For longer distances, biofuels and synthetic fuels derived from renewable sources offer a bridge. Companies are even experimenting with hydrogen-powered aircraft, which could, in theory, leave only water vapor in their wake. The image of airports humming with clean, silent aircraft no longer belongs only to science fiction. It is a necessity for survival. Another frontier lies in intelligence. Modern airliners already rely heavily on autopilot, but artificial intelligence is pushing aviation toward true autonomy. Cargo drones, the size of small planes, are being tested, capable of flying without human pilots. Urban planners envision air taxis, autonomous electric vehicles that whisk commuters over congested streets. For passengers, the idea of boarding a pilotless jet may seem unsettling, but history suggests acceptance follows utility. Just as elevators once required human operators, airplanes may one day fly themselves, monitored by ground-based controllers and AI systems that never tire, never grow distracted. The romance of the cockpit may fade, but safety and efficiency may soar. Though Concorde's demise in 2003 seemed to close the chapter on supersonic travel, new companies are determined to reopen it. Advances in materials, aerodynamics, and noise reduction promise a new generation of supersonic, even hypersonic passenger planes. Imagine New York to London in 3 hours, or Tokyo to Los Angeles in 5. Business, diplomacy, even ordinary tourism could once again bend time itself. But this time, speed must be balanced with sustainability. A supersonic, jet-guzzling fuel cannot survive in a world fighting climate change. Engineers must design aircraft that are both swift and responsible, a challenge that may define the next great leap in aviation. Perhaps the most dramatic frontier is not in the skies at all, but beyond them. Spaceflight, once the exclusive domain of superpower governments, has entered the hands of private entrepreneurs. Companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic are racing to create a market for space tourism. What was once the dream of astronauts may soon be the holiday of billionaires and eventually of ordinary citizens. More than tourism, the integration of space and aviation hints at a new era. Suborbital flights that carry passengers from one side of the world to the other in under 2 hours, riding the edge of space. If realized, the planet would become smaller than ever before. And beyond even that lies the ultimate question. Will humanity one day extend the Wright's gift of wings not only across Earth but across the solar system? Mars colonization, lunar bases, asteroid mining all begin with flight. The flyer may have risen only 12 seconds above the sand, but its legacy could carry us to the stars. Yet through all visions of the future, the paradox remains. Flight has always been both a promise and a peril. It has brought families together and torn cities apart. It has carried explorers to new worlds and delivered bombs into old ones. In the future, as humanity designs greener engines, autonomous pilots, supersonic routes, and spacefaring ships, the question is not only what can we build, but what should we build? The Wright brothers never sought to unleash war or climate change. They sought only to solve a problem that had baffled humanity for millennia: how to control the air, how to give men wings, Every generation since has carried their invention further, sometimes toward peace, sometimes toward devastation. The responsibility of the future is to carry it wisely. On a cold December morning in 1903, two brothers launched a fragile craft into the air for just 12 seconds. Today, airliners circle the globe in endless motion, satellites map the Earth from orbit, and rockets pierce the void beyond. Every one of these marvels is an echo of that moment on the dunes of Kitty Hawk. The world they created is not the one they imagined. It is larger, smaller, brighter, darker, a world where the sky is both highway and battlefield, both bridge and barrier. Yet the essence of their achievement endures. They proved that the impossible could be made real. As we step into a future of green aircraft, pilotless jets, supersonic speeds, and journeys to the stars, we are still living in the wake of the Wright brothers' first flight. Theirs was not merely an invention, it was a turning point in the story of humankind, the moment when Earth ceased to be our only horizon, and the sky became both our playground and our destiny.